Chapter 6, Misha. After the introductions in the attic eased into a pattern that passed for normal conversation, the group arranged itself in a loose circle among the old trunks and storage boxes. Dusty beams stretched overhead while the faint glow from the attic window washed the room in pale light. The others seemed perfectly comfortable there, as if the attic functioned as a kind of informal gathering room for the dead. Rebecca had started explaining some of the strange advantages of being a ghost, how walls no longer mattered, how distance felt meaningless once you learned to drift through space instead of walking through it. Stanley had launched into a long, amused complaint about the indignity of not being able to travel since the early 20th century. I listened, nodded, even laughed once or twice. But my thoughts weren't really there. Then the doorbell rang. The sound echoed faintly through the house, traveling upward through the ceiling until it reached the attic. Every instinct inside me reacted to it immediately. "Someone's at the door," I said without thinking. The others barely reacted. Rebecca waved her hand casually as if the fact that living beings ringing doorbells was the most ordinary event imaginable. "Go see who it is," she suggested. Curiosity pulled me to the floor before anyone could say anything else. I drifted downward through the attic boards, past the empty bedroom on the first floor, then into the foyer below. The front door came into view. Through the frosted glass, I could see a familiar silhouette standing on the porch. Harper. She stood there with a smirk on her face and a bottle of wine in her hand, rocking slightly on her heels while she waited for Zara to open the door. I stared at her through the door. It was late for a visit, especially on a weekday. The thought surfaced automatically. Harper had been careful about work schedules and responsibilities. She ran my restaurant now, or rather, she managed it for my family. I had heard enough of their conversations during my wandering around the house to piece together that arrangement. She had stepped into that role without hesitation after I died. That fact alone should have filled me with gratitude. The restaurant meant the world to my parents. They had poured years of hope into watching me build that place. Knowing Harper had kept it alive for them should have been comforting. And she had looked after Zara, too. I had watched that countless times over the past years. Phone calls. Visits. Relaxed evenings where she brought food over because she knew Zara wouldn't cook for herself. Harper had been loyal. Reliable. A good friend. So why did her presence at the doorway tonight make my chest draw tight? Zara opened the door and greeted her warmly. Harper held up the bottle with an exaggerated flourish and stepped inside. I automatically followed them into the living room. They sat on the couch as they usually did, pouring wine and slipping into the kind of easy conversation that happens when two people know each other well enough to skip small talk entirely. Usually, I wandered through the room during these visits without paying much heed. Tonight felt different. I stood near the edge of the room watching them while they talked. A strange heaviness spread through me. Which made absolutely no sense. I was dead. Ghosts didn't have lungs to tighten or hearts to pound. Ghosts shouldn't feel anything at all. Technically speaking, I had no organs, no bloodstream, no physical system capable of producing emotion. The body responsible for those reactions had been destroyed years ago on a stretch of road I could barely remember now. And yet the feelings existed. The heartache had never left. The anger about losing my life still surfaced without warning. The ache of watching Zara cry herself to sleep had followed me every night. Now another emotion joined the list. Jealousy. It arrived slowly, creeping through my thoughts until I could no longer pretend it wasn't there. Zara mentioned the upcoming date. That was what they were talking about. The lunch Riley had arranged. I had overheard enough of the conversation earlier to understand the context. Harper nodded along as Zara explained the situation, occasionally offering reassuring comments between sips of wine. At first, I listened with mild curiosity. Then I noticed how close Harper was sitting. Closer than usual. Their shoulders nearly touched. Harper leaned slightly to Zara while she spoke, her attention completely fixed on her. I had watched these two interact for years. They had been affectionate friends, but there had mostly been a comfortable distance between them. Tonight, that distance had disappeared. They were studying each other with an intensity that sent a painful twist through my chest. What the hell was happening in my house? The thought burned through my mind before I could stop it. My house. My wife. My best friend. The absurdity of that claim struck immediately afterward. I didn't own anything anymore. Not the house. Not the life that continued here. Not even the person sitting on that couch. Zara wasn't mine anymore. Yet watching Harper lean to her stirred a helpless anger that I couldn't explain. It wasn't rational. It wasn't fair. It wasn't even appropriate. I had died. Zara had every right to move forward. Every right to build a life that didn't revolve around a memory. Every logical part of me understood that. The emotional part refused to cooperate. Thankfully, Zara budged first, breaking the strange tension before it could stretch any further. Relief washed through me in a wave so strong it almost embarrassed me. Harper eventually stood and grabbed her jacket. I should head out, she said. They walked together to the foyer. I hesitated before following them, unsure whether I actually wanted to see the end of this interaction. Curiosity won anyway. From my position near the wall, I watched Harper pause near the door. She turned to Zara. Then she leaned forward. Her lips brushed gently against Zara's cheek. The contact lasted only an instant. That was enough. A surge of fury shot through me so suddenly it felt explosive. My non-existent blood felt as if it were boiling inside veins that didn't exist. I stood there staring at them, the irrational anger roaring through my thoughts while the logical part of my mind whispered the same useless reminder over and over. You're a ghost. You shouldn't give a damn about any of this. And yet I did. Zara didn't react as I expected. She didn't move. She didn't laugh awkwardly or step back to create distance between herself and Harper. She simply stood there, accepting the kiss on her cheek as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. That small incident sparked a sudden fire within me. The anger arrived without warning and spread through me in violent waves. I didn't think about what I was doing. I simply reacted. My arms swung wildly to the foyer table, my palms striking at objects that weren't supposed to move. My fists drove into the wall beside me. My foot lashed out at the base of the table. Every movement carried the same desperate frustration. It was useless. For years, I had tried touching things. I had pushed, pulled, shouted, and even tried grabbing Zara's arm when she cried herself to sleep. Nothing ever happened. My body passed through the world like smoke through an open window. The anger made me forget that. I lashed out again, kicking the table near the foyer as the front door closed behind Harper. The impact should have meant nothing. My foot should have slipped through the wood as it regularly did. But that didn't happen. In its place, the table jolted. The vase resting on top of it tipped sideways. For a breath, I simply watched the movement unfold, too stunned to react. The vase slid off the edge. It struck the hardwood floor with a sharp crack and shattered into dozens of white fragments that scattered across the foyer. I froze. The silence that followed felt almost louder than the crash itself. How? The question barely formed in my mind before another presence appeared beside me. Rebecca materialized at my shoulder, her eyes wide with disbelief. How did you do that? She demanded, her palms rising to cover her mouth as she stared at the broken pieces on the floor. I didn't mean to, I said, still staring at the mess. I was just angry. My gaze moved between my own translucent hands and the shattered vase. I was thrashing around and it just fell. Rebecca crouched beside the broken ceramic, her fingers passing curiously through the fragments. That's not supposed to happen by accident, she said slowly. She observed me again, excitement creeping into her expression. Some ghosts can move objects, she continued. They can create noise, knock things over, sometimes even talk to the living. Her voice lowered slightly. But that kind of control takes effort. Focus. Practice. Rebecca pushed herself upright again. Most ghosts never manage it, My attention shifted to Zara. She stood in the living room doorway staring at the shattered vase, her face pale with shock. Her gaze moved slowly across the foyer as if searching for an explanation that refused to appear. Fear lingered in her expression. That sight struck harder than the anger ever had. I didn't want her to be afraid of this house. I didn't want her to be afraid of me. Without saying another word, I drifted upward through the ceiling and returned to the attic. The familiar room greeted me with calm. Most of the others had wandered off during the evening, leaving only Mrs. Martin seated comfortably beside one of the old trunks near the center of the room. She glanced up as I approached. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked gently. Her voice carried a patient warmth, shaped by witnessing centuries of human emotion rise and recede. "I don't know," I admitted, lowering myself beside her. "I feel like I'm losing control of myself." Mrs. Martin studied my face carefully. "That tends to happen when angst changes shape," she said thoughtfully. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my forehead even though the gesture served no real purpose anymore. "I can't stand the thought of watching her move on," I confessed. Before Mrs. Martin could respond, Rebecca floated through the ceiling behind me, clearly eager to report what had happened downstairs. "You should have seen it," she blurted out. She shoved the table, and the vase flew straight off the edge. Rebecca gestured enthusiastically to me. Her wife appeared completely terrified. Mrs. Martin raised one eyebrow. "Is that so?" She turned back to me. "Well then," she said calmly, "what you experienced wasn't unusual." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Martin folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Rage can sometimes break through the barrier between our world and theirs," she explained. "Strong emotions create a kind of pressure. When that pressure becomes intense enough, objects in the physical world may respond." Rebecca nodded eagerly beside us. "That's exactly what I was telling her." Mrs. Martin tilted her head slightly. "But anger is rarely the best tool for communication." My concentration honed in immediately. "What do you mean by communication?" She smiled knowingly. "There are far better ways to reach the living." The words landed heavily in my thoughts. My head lifted quickly as hope flickered through the confusion swirling inside me. "You mean I could actually interact with Zara?" Mrs. Martin nodded slowly. "It's possible." Rebecca leaned closer as well, clearly interested in the explanation. "How?" I asked, filled with sudden urgency. Mrs. Martin signaled to the attic floor. "You must concentrate your energy," she said patiently. "Not through rage, but through intention." Her gaze remained steady on mine. "Think carefully about what you want to do. Hold that thought with absolute clarity. If your concentration is strong enough, the world may respond." I stared at her, the idea mending into my mind like the first hint of light after a long night. "You're saying I could learn to reach her?" Mrs. Martin's smile softened. "With practice," she replied. "And patience." I lowered my gaze, staring at the attic floorboards while Mrs. Martin's words echoed inside my mind. The house felt unusually serene beneath us. Somewhere far below, the living world continued moving without any awareness of the conversation unfolding above their head. A decision formed slowly inside me. "I'm going to learn how to communicate with her," I said finally. The words came out composed, even though the emotions behind them churned violently inside my chest. I lifted my head and gazed at the dark rafters stretching overhead. "I have to," I continued. "She deserves to know I'm still here. She deserves to know I'm not suffering somewhere, that I'm all right." My voice tempered slightly. "And that I still love her." The confession lingered in the air. Mrs. Martin didn't respond immediately. Instead, she placed a gentle palm on my shoulder. Her touch carried a gravity that made me turn to her again. "Be very careful with that intention," she said gently. The warmth within her had given way to a more serious presence now. "These things you're considering, they are not conventional, darling." She withdrew her hand and folded both palms together in her lap. "There are souls who attempt what you're planning," she continued, her tone patient but firm. They become so consumed with reaching the living that they lose their balance between the two worlds. Rebecca leaned closer, listening with curiosity. Mrs. Martin's gaze drifted briefly to the window. I have seen ghosts who refuse to let go, she went on. They linger in that desperate state for so long that their minds unravel. They stop remembering who they were. They wander endlessly through the afterlife, unable to fade, unable to rest. Her eyes returned to mine. They exist in a state of emptiness. No peace. No purpose. No sleep. A faint shiver ran through me. And the living? I asked. Mrs. Martin sighed. They can suffer as well, she replied. If the living become aware of us too clearly, they sometimes cling to that connection. They stop moving forward with their lives. They refuse to let grief evolve into acceptance. Her posture relaxed again. They remain trapped in the past, waiting for someone who cannot return. The warning sank deep inside me. I understand, I said after considering her words. And I promise I'm not rushing into this blindly. I straightened slightly. You don't have to worry about me losing my mind over it. I've already had years to think about what I lost. Mrs. Martin studied my face carefully before nodding. I can see that. Silence returned to the attic. For a while, I watched the faint moonlight filtering through the small window near the roofline. The outside world had grown dark, the sky stretching wide and endless beyond the glass. A new question surfaced in my thoughts. Mrs. Martin, I said gently, turning back to her. If you don't mind me asking, how did you die? Rebecca immediately perked up. Oh yes, she said, scooting closer. I want to hear this too. Mrs. Martin tilted her head slightly. Are you sure you wish to know? I nodded. Her lips curved into a faint smile. Well, she said, rising slowly to her feet. It was such a long time ago, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. She walked to the window and rested her palms against the wooden sill. The night stretched beyond the glass, dark and muted, the distant lights of the neighborhood glowing faintly in the distance. Her posture changed subtly as memory pulled her backward through time. I was 30 years old when I died, she began. The words carried the weight of another era. I had been married for 2 years by then. That was the dream I carried through my entire youth, marrying the man I loved and building a life together. Her eyes remained fixed on the darkness outside as she spoke. We were childhood sweethearts, she continued. We met during our school days and stayed inseparable ever since. Rebecca folded her arms, leaning back against one of the wooden beams while listening. After we finished school, Mrs. Martin said, we both began working in his father's grocery shop back in New York. The name of the city seemed to carry a distant echo of noise and energy even here in the attic. Rebecca raised a curious eyebrow. Why did you wait so long to get married? Mrs. Martin chuckled softly. Oh, life was complicated even then, she replied. She turned slightly from the window, her gaze drifting somewhere far beyond the attic walls. We spent several years trying to decide what kind of future we wanted. Where would we live? What kind of life could we build together? Her hands rested lightly on the windowsill as if she could still feel the past beneath her fingers. Eventually, we came here, she said. We wanted a quieter place. A calmer life far from the chaos of New York. The faint smile returned. He opened his own grocery shop just around the corner. Her eyes sparkled with fond remembrance. And I began babysitting children in this very house. Rebecca glanced around the attic with new interest. You mean right here? Mrs. Martin nodded. Yes. She sighed dramatically as the memories unfolded. It was such a peaceful life in the beginning. We had neighbors who greeted each other every morning. Children running down the street in the afternoons. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery near the beginning of the road. She closed her gaze briefly, letting the images settle. I loved every part of it. I watched her silently, imagining the house as it must have appeared over a century ago. wooden wagons instead of cars. Gas lamps flickered along the street. The simplicity of a world that moved at a slower pace. "And then you got married," Rebecca said gently. Mrs. Martin nodded. "Yes." Her smile grew warmer. "Our families were overjoyed when we finally tied the knot. They filled our small home with gifts and laughter. Everyone expected us to start a family immediately." She glanced back at us. "They kept asking when the babies would arrive." The tenderness in her appearance carried a hint of sadness now. "That was the life we thought we were building." I felt an ache forming in my chest as I listened. She had been so young. 30 years old. Her entire future had been waiting just ahead of her. And somehow it had all vanished in a single terrible moment. Mrs. Martin released a long breath that seemed to carry decades of memory with it. She lowered herself into the old recliner beside the attic window, the chair creaking faintly beneath a body that no longer had weight. Outside, the night stretched across the neighborhood in darkness, the distant streetlights casting soft halos through the glass. Her gaze drifted to the sky while she spoke. "It happened on a very ordinary afternoon," she said. "I was watching the children in this house, just as I had done countless times before." Her fingers traced the worn wooden armrest of the chair as if the motion helped her reconnect with that day. "The little ones had been playing upstairs," she continued. "They were hiding from me as part of some game they had invented. I climbed to the top of the staircase, calling their names, pretending to be terribly concerned so they would reveal themselves." A faint smile touched her lips. "One of them decided it would be very funny to jump out from behind the wall and shout to frighten me." The smile faded. "I startled easily in those days," she added softly. My foot slipped. Her eyes lowered to the floorboards beneath her. I tumbled down the staircase. The attic felt colder as the image formed in my mind. "I struck the floor below and broke my neck," she said plainly. Death came quickly. There was no dramatic struggle. No time for anyone to fetch a doctor. By the time anyone understood what had happened, I was already gone. A sharp wave of shock ran through me. "Oh my God," I murmured, my fingers curling tightly into a fist. "That's horrible." Rebecca had grown quiet as well, her usual humor replaced with respectful silence. Mrs. Martin's concentration remained fixed on the darkness beyond the window. "The accident itself was terrible," she admitted. "But the days that followed were worse." Her palm rose slowly to rest against her chest. "I stayed close to my husband after that." The tenderness in her voice deepened. "He was devastated. Completely lost without me. I could almost see the scenes unfolding in the attic. He refused to leave our home," she continued. "He kept it exactly as I had left it. My dresses still hung in the wardrobe. My books remained on the bedside table. Even my favorite teacup stayed untouched in the kitchen." She trembled slightly. Years passed on. Rebecca leaned forward gently. "He couldn't let you go." Mrs. Martin nodded. "Every time I returned to see him," she said, "it felt as if the accident had claimed both our lives instead of just mine." Her expression grew pained as she remembered. "He walked through the house like a man carrying a ghost on his shoulders. I watched him sit alone at the dinner table. I watched him stare at my empty chair in the evenings." Her fingers tightened slightly. "It made me feel responsible for his suffering. As though my death had destroyed his life as well." I swallowed hard, struggling to imagine the torment of witnessing that kind of grief without being able to intervene. "How did you endure it?" I asked carefully. The question carried hesitation. Part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Mrs. Martin grew silent again. "Time," she said eventually. "Time does strange things to grief." She leaned back slightly in the recliner, her concentration drifting to the ceiling beams above us. "One day I went to see him and sensed that a change had taken hold." Rebecca moved closer. "What happened?" Mrs. Martin's lips curved into a gentle smile. "He had begun attending church more often," she said. "There was a woman there who had recently lost her own husband." Her eyes brightened faintly with the memory. They began speaking after services. At first, it was simple companionship. Two lonely people finding comfort in shared sorrow. She clasped her hands together again. In time, that companionship deepened into a bond that ran far beneath the surface. I felt my chest tighten as I listened. They fell in love. Mrs. Martin nodded. Yes. Her voice carried no bitterness. They married a few years later. Their home was filled with laughter again. Children arrived not long after. Rebecca tilted her head. And when you saw that? Mrs. Martin turned back at us. I came to understand a truth that carried real weight. She spoke the words with sureness. I was happy for him. The statement hit me like a spark landing on dry wood. How could you be happy? I demanded, the anger rising before I could stop it. The man you loved spent his entire life with somebody else after you were gone. He built a new family. A new future. My fists tightened again. And you're telling me you were happy about it? The thought felt impossible to accept. That means whatever you had together just disappeared. As if you never existed. That's absurd. The room fell silent. Mrs. Martin rose slowly from the recliner. For a brief instant, it seemed as though she might reach out to calm me. Her hand lifted slightly, her expression filled with patient sympathy. Then she paused. Instead of touching me, she lowered her hand again and stepped back. She understood that anger like mine rarely responded to comfort. Without another word, I turned and drifted downward through the attic floor, leaving the room behind. The familiar shape of the house rushed past me as I descended. I didn't stop. Behind me, I faintly heard Rebecca speaking softly to Mrs. Martin, offering reassurance in my absence. The sound carried a small measure of comfort. At least someone remained with her while I struggled with emotions I still didn't know how to control.